I think every human is sort of a walking parable. So the way that they live carries indirect messages to other people about how other people should live or what we think is right and true and good.
For someone who is, not giving sermons or a teacher, why would studying homiletics be beneficial to them, like in any industry?
The capacity to communicate your ideas in compelling and even transformative ways can be a really important skill in any kind of field. So much of what we do is based on how we communicate our ideas and to make sure that they seem relevant and they're powerful and that people care about what you're saying. And so I think that's one way that homiletics, or at least the study of communication, can be really beneficial to a lot of people. But
How can you use that principle to help people change?
the best way to invite someone to change is to not to tell them directly how to change.
What's the benefit of just not straight up telling them this is the answer?
When people discover an answer for themselves, they just feel more ownership for it. They're more likely to be influenced by it if they discover the answer for themselves. Humans, they don't really experience abstract principles very well. Humans are much more likely to experience specific stories, imageries, metaphor, parables that occur in time and space. That's why we like movies, that's why we like novels. If people have a powerful experience, they're more likely to change.
Do you think that these principles can be overused?
Don't try to manipulate people's emotion. You give the listener distance to think for themselves how to make sense of what you're saying. Just let it do its own work. I think that can be very powerful.
Brother Taeger, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing, Sam?
I'm doing awesome. So, Brother Taeger, if you could introduce introduce yourself to the audience, tell us a little bit about you, that would be awesome.
Yeah, my name's Stephan Taeger, and I know Sam because we're in the same ward, the same church congregation, and I'm a professor at BYU, and I teach New Testament and the Book of Mormon. I also teach homiletics, which is the study of preaching, and my research at BYU focuses a lot on preaching and narrative instruction and scripture. Those are kind of the things that I talk a lot about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's cool. How did you get into that originally?
Yeah, I think I used to be a seminary teacher here in Utah, and I just wanted to improve my teaching, and so I started studying homiletics, and I was really interested in creating narrative-like experiences for my students when they were in class. I wanted the class to feel like they were engaging in a narrative. The lesson structure was like a narrative structure, and so that's kind of how I got started doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So for someone who is, not giving sermons or a teacher, why would studying homiletics be beneficial to them, like in any industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing I would say is the capacity to communicate your ideas in compelling and even transformative ways, in a way that transforms the listener, or at least invites them to be transformed, can be a really important skill in any kind of field. So much of what we do is based on how we communicate our ideas and to make sure that they seem relevant and they're powerful and that people care about what you're saying. And so I think that's one way that homiletics, or at least the study of communication, can be really beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. How could someone, go about learning more about homiletics and actually implementing that into their communication?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would read about it, get some good books about homiletics, and then I would listen to the best preachers who are out there and start to see how they're implementing certain homiletic principles into their preaching and teaching. That kind of thing I think is always really beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah. And what impact have you seen, that study have within your teaching?
Well, I think one thing is I noticed that students overall were just having a more impactful experience. Because I'm interested in narrative structure and how it affects teaching a lot, I noticed that my students would pay attention more, and I wish I could take credit for those ideas, but most of it I just gathered from other homileticians and storytellers and just try to combine it in my own way. And so I think that's at least two ways. One, it just seemed to be more impactful, and two, the students seemed to pay attention more.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's say, some of the listeners do go and actually study more about it. But then some of them don't. I bet it would be helpful to them if we taught them, or if you taught them a little bit more about it right now. So if you were trying to teach me principles from homiletics that would be relevant, what do you think I would need to know?
Well, there's a lot to be said about this, but as far as the real practical advice, it would come down to three things for me, and we can dive into these as much as you want. But the first one would be to frame your teaching or communication around a question and an answer. So I would ask myself, what question am I raising, and then how do I get to that? How am I going to help the listener discover that answer? For example, yesterday I watched a teacher and they raised a question at the beginning of class, but I thought the answer that they were going to land on was going to be pretty obvious. And I think for the most part, what the teacher could have done is taken that question and then nuanced it and helped the listener think deeper about it. And so you want to have a really good quality question and a really profound answer. That's number one. The second thing is to teach in concrete language. So really paint the picture. Show, don't tell is what you learn in eighth grade English class. Use nouns that are experiential. So you could say that Christmas is a wonderful time, or you could say Christmas has, trees and Nat King Cole music and the fire and stockings, and you can really paint the picture, right? And then finally, the last thing I would say is don't over explain things. So be economical in language. And then also don't try to manipulate people's emotions. So that's what some preachers would call distance. So you give the listener distance to think for themselves how to make sense of what you're saying. And then also you give them emotional distance in the sense, or emotional space in the sense that you're not coming across manipulative.
Yeah,
So those three things, yeah, that's a lot, but
but that's like boiled down what homiletics is then.
I think those are three principles that I find really helpful and can be applied really quickly to
Yeah,
communication. Yeah.
yeah. So how might someone apply that first principle of, remind me what that one was again?
Yeah. So you raise a question and then you answer it. Yep.
So how might someone apply that?
Yeah. So they might ask themselves, what questions does a listener care about regarding this topic? And then so they'll raise that question and then they might provide some background information before they come to the answer. They might give some false answers to the answers. They say some people think it's this, but that doesn't work because of this. You also might raise the stakes in the sense of you might tell people why they want to get to the answer. And this is all happening before you actually answer. But then at a certain point, you start providing data and information that points the listener to what you want them to think the answer is. And often that's done best if you can sort of lead them along and into a discovery where they can make their own conclusions about what the answer is.
Yeah, so what's the benefit of just not straight up telling them this is the answer and leading them towards the answer?
Well, I think when people discover an answer for themselves, they just feel more ownership for it. And they also I think are more likely to agree with it. And maybe a better way to say that is they're more likely to be influenced by it if they discover the answer for themselves. And that's the way that Jesus taught often, was he would give parables and let people discover things for themselves. It also brings down the defense mechanisms where people, if you get up and tell them how to live their life, often they'll just be defensive. But if you give them a little bit of space, then they can decide for themselves, how they're going to relate to that information. And I think it's quite surprisingly that is the best way to invite someone to change, or one of the best ways, is to not to tell them directly how to change, but to let them discover how they should change.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of how you use that principle of letting them find the answer?
Yeah. So often when I end my class periods or my lectures, I will lead my students up to sort of a main point, and I'll either indirectly state it or only state it very lightly. And so that's almost all of my lessons feel sort of like, or I try to at least, lead the student to a climactic point, and then they sort of have to figure out a little bit for themselves what the message was. And I don't want students to be confused. I'm not interested in that. The goal is really to help them to discover for themselves how the main message of a lecture will relate to their lives.
Yeah. And is there any times outside of teaching when you saw someone, doing something that might not be beneficial and you think that change would be good for them, that you've used that principle to, lead them towards change?
That's a well. Explain your question. I'm not sure I quite follow.
Yeah, yeah. So just like outside of teaching, how can you use that principle to help people change?
Oh, I think I think every human is sort of a walking parable. So the way that they live carries indirect messages to other people. And so you say a lot about what you think is important and how you think people should live just by your everyday decisions. And so whether we like it or not, we're always giving indirect messages about how other people should live or what we think is right and true and good.
Yeah, yeah. And then that second principle of being economical and using straightforward language, what's the benefit there?
So if you being economical in language,
Or what were you saying the second principle was again?
just being concrete,
Concrete, yeah,
being
yeah.
yeah. The reason why is because humans, they don't really experience abstract principles very well. So if you say something like hard work leads to success or whatever, then people don't, that might lead to clarity, but humans are much more likely to experience specific stories, imageries, metaphor, parables that occur in time and space. That's why we like movies. That's why we like novels, is because we vicariously feel alongside the storyteller or what's happening in the story. And so the closer your language can be more descriptive or more feel like a story, the more likely people are going to experience alongside the material that you're delivering.
And just having them, helping them connect closer to the story, that will help, bring them to the answer and, possibly lead towards change or the main point that you want to bring home.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I do work from the assumption that if people have a powerful experience, they're more likely to change.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that these principles can be overused at all? Because I've heard some of this stuff before, like in communication and
Hmm.
storytelling of, describing. Do you think there's a point where it goes too far versus not far enough?
Yeah, I think a lot of times stories can be simplistic, or stories can be used in a manipulative way, or stories are can be used as an excuse not to think deeply or very precisely about issues. I'm all about thinking very precisely. When we need to use abstract principles, reason, logic, rationality, then we have to do that. And so any good thing can be used, for bad motives or just too much or in a way that simplifies things. So I think those are some ways that it might go too far.
Yeah, yeah. And then the third principle, you're saying that was to make sure you don't manipulate with what you're
Yeah, yeah.
saying?
Yeah, you don't want to over explain things. So one way to do that is to tell a story but not give the abstract moral at the end. You just tell the story, and hopefully there's enough context around the story where they can figure out what the story was meant to do. It's sort of like you don't need to explain a good joke. And
Yeah.
next time you watch someone who's teaching, watch what happens to the energy level in the room when someone starts explaining what they were talking about, or explaining a story is a better way to say it. People
Yeah.
people kind of check out at that moment. Yeah.
What common mistakes do you see people making their communications and, specifically when giving church talks and stuff like that, but then also just in general communication that will help, or, those mistakes are hindering the message that they're giving?
I think one thing I see people do is to over explain things or explain things too many times. So trust that people are following if you're speaking clearly and you're using good illustrations. I think another thing I see people doing is that they don't have a real strong sense of unity to their message. So it's really important, I think, to try to unify our message around a central theme, idea, image. And that doesn't mean you're not going to have subpoints. Of course, you can do that. But to really have a strong sense of unity, I think is really important. And then sometimes people come across manipulative or they're trying too hard. And so you want to, so they either are worried that they don't want to seem like they're trying to create an emotional experience, so they just go completely sort of stale and monotone, or they try too hard to create an emotional experience for people. But the best way to help someone have an experience is to teach with experiential material. So that's where the concrete comes in, and then just let it do its own work. I think that can be very powerful.
Yeah. So concrete being like actually describing. So instead of saying, Christmas is wonderful, but you say what's wonderful about it because it helps them better understand.
Yeah, absolutely. To paint the picture of whatever ideas that we're talking about. Now, when people sense that we're doing that for the sake of it, stories become tedious, and you're like, ah, here comes another illustration. So it has to be done in a way where people think that the stories and images and metaphors we're using are actually adding to the insight or of what the teacher is trying to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah. So could you, um, given like share a story that you think there is a principle that might be helpful to young men and so we can see these principles in action.
Sure, I'd be happy
All
to.
right.
This is a parable I tell in my classes. Okay, and it came to pass that there was a boy named Tyler who lived in a BYU singles ward, and you asked out a girl named Ashley. And let me tell you about Tyler. Every single day he got up and read scripture. He said his prayers morning and night. He also wrote in his journal every single night at least a paragraph. He went to the temple once a month during the school year and once a week during the summer. He also was very well read, and he played basketball extremely well, and he had developed his own unique style of playing piano. And Ashley thought Tyler was also a very handsome kid. So Tyler worked up the courage to ask out Ashley, and they went to a very fine dining place called Burger Supreme in Provo, Utah. They sat down and started to start the date and enjoy their meal together. And Tyler took a bite out of his hamburger, and he walked to the front of Burger Supreme, and he overly dramatically dropped his green tray on the counter and said, "I said no onions." Then they finished their meal, and as Tyler was driving Ashley back to her apartment, Tyler saw a kid he knew from Provo High, and he said, "Oh, Ashley, I knew that kid in high school. He was such a loser." And then when they got to Ashley's apartment across the street, there was an older guy who was bringing a bunch of boxes out of the back of his car. And Tyler looked at the older guy and he looked at Ashley, and then he looked at the older guy, and then he looked at Ashley, and he said, "I had a great time today, Ashley." And he drove home. And so I often put a quote up from President Henry B. Eyring after that. And I can tell you what that quote says, or I can let you figure out what, we can analyze that parable, or we can just let it hang in the air, Samuel, whatever you want to do.
Yeah. Okay, so is there a an overarching message that we're supposed to pick up from that?
So this is the quote I share from President Eyring after, where he basically says something like, "Don't think of yourself as someone who is seeking sanctification. Think of yourself as someone who is trying to help others." And then he says, basically, do that, pray on that, act in that way, and that will have a sanctifying effect on you. And so the point of the parable, and in the context of the lesson, hopefully students sense the meaning of it, is that people can be very, very self-disciplined and have lots of unique talents and goals and be working towards great things. But if they don't think outwardly, if they don't see the humanity of other people, then it doesn't really matter. Paul says, without charity, we are nothing. And so whatever individual, accomplishments we are nothing unless we have uh, charity for other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because you started by, saying all the good stuff that he's doing, and it's like, oh, it sounds like a pretty solid guy, but then you hear how he is treating and talking about other people. I think what I pick up from that is, there's no saving ordinances or anything like that. Like you could go to the temple, you could attend church, but if it's not actually changing you, then there's not much use to that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I one of the ways that you can help people change in a story is help them identify with a certain character, and then either show them how that character has flaws or show them how that character changes for the better. I In that particular parable, that person, we see his flaws, but once someone identifies with a character or a certain viewpoint, then you can do things to help them have a different perspective because they will follow along with that character, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, because there was a lot of stuff in there that resonates with me, like high discipline and stuff like that. And so I was able to better follow along with the story and see it through Tyler's eyes. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of discipline too. In fact, I think it's something that's really undervalued in our culture. And even though there's a lot of talk about it, I still think it's greatly undervalued. And so often the best way to help people see their own faults is to create characters who have a lot of positive things and then so people will identify with them and then you can give them certain faults, certain ways that they fall short in the way that they act. And then people will say, hope I'm not like that.
Huh. That's interesting. I was listening to a podcast a while ago. It was Russell Brunson's, and he was talking about how his kid was talking with, one of his employees' kids or something, and how, they're having all of these cool conversations about how kids these days, like, they're always gaming and doing all this stuff. And he's like, my kid did all that stuff, but because it was put in a negative connotation, it's like, oh yeah, this isn't stuff we like to do. And so I think by identifying with a certain character trait, that probably does help people change. Do you think that is that kind of what you are trying to get across?
Yeah, I think when you so sometimes they'll identify because they see how they identify with the character because the character has something that they like that they want to emulate. And then sometimes they identify with the character because the character demonstrates characteristics that they can see in themselves that they don't like. And so that's typically or often how you can help people change through good characterization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So with social media these days, everyone is getting used to, here's like the three tips and the three facts. It'd probably be helpful if you could, share stories more on social media to help people change. Do you think that's still possible, even though people are conditioned for like a 20-second video and then they just go on to the next one?
Yeah, I actually do think that that is possible, uh, and primarily because I think humans are storytelling creatures. We exist in time and space. Our lives are sort of like an unfolding narrative. And so I think story will always play an important part. And and typically, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like cultures just go back and forth. So one minute they'll want more stories, and then other minutes they'll want clear, concise principles. And so I think the best communicators sort of read where a culture's at and then speak accordingly, and adapt their speaking to what people are used to, but then also, can challenge the people and use different communication techniques. And so, yeah, I think that that's still possible.
Yeah, yeah. I like what you're saying about how you got to read where people are at and then match that.
Yeah, yeah. Read where they're at, match it, and then also challenge it a little bit as well. You know,
Yeah, yeah, because you want to be ready for when it's going the other direction.
right, right.
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about discipline. I can't remember if it was you that were quoting or someone. I've heard this quote before from one of the church leaders, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they said discipline is attractive, and that stuck with me. Is that a quote, or did I just make that up?
I don't know. I haven't heard that
Or is it
one.
something else? I might be paraphrasing here, but I remember that one. I think it's from one of the church leaders, and maybe it's obedience is attractive, but that's something that's like, okay, if I want to be attractive, I'll just obey what God says, and then it'll work out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that discipline really is attractive in a lot of different senses. When people are dating, discipline shows that someone is like stable and strong, and you know, and people ultimately want to be around that kind of thing. They want safety and stability, and obviously that's not the only thing that people want, but and that's not just in romantic relationships, but I think discipline also, employers want that, and family members want people around them to be disciplined. I mean, disciplined is an act of love because it says that I'm going to work to create a flourishing family and society and neighborhood. I'm going to sacrifice for the benefit of the people around me is often what discipline. Now, discipline can obviously be a selfish thing as well, But work is so laziness. I mean, hopefully this isn't too strong, but laziness is a form of hatred. When we're working hard and we're disciplined for the right reasons, we're we're spending a lot of our time in service to other people. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. So talking a little bit on, work, like work and family, do you have any thoughts on like the principles of work-life balance, or is it more like a harmony for you? Because I'm sure that your job takes up a lot of your time, and so how do you show up in work, show up for yourself, and also show up for your family?
Yeah. The way that I think about that kind of thing is that I try to get really clear about what is work time and what is family time. And I have a very specific schedule. And I think that that's just something I can do for the people around me and for my employers to say, okay, this is the kinds of thing I'm going to do at work. And then at this, around this time, if I'm staying on top of things, then I'll be able to spend this much time at home. And so in my own life, I have found that the more I am organized, the more freedom I feel like I have.
Yeah,
That's just the way it goes for me.
yeah, that's interesting because I've definitely noticed that too. Because some people will talk about how, they want to have freedom to do whatever you want, but if you don't put those routines in place, you won't be able to because you're just going to be pulled so many different directions and you won't have control over your time.
Yeah, and I once heard a preacher I really love named Fred Craddock say, if you set time for work, you're okay because you know that you'll have time to play later. And when you set time for play, you're not stressing about the work you need to get done because you also have time that you've set for work as well. And so emotional freedom, I think a lot of it comes from having a spot for the very different things in your life that you want to get done. Plus, uh, man, I, I think, I mean, I'll just speak openly for a second. I think there's a lot of self deception around time management, in the sense that people think that they can do way more than they actually
Yeah.
can. So when you write it down, this is what I'm going to do from this time to that time to this, you just start to get really honest about what your limits are as a human on this planet, and you just say, okay, I got to decide, what am I going to do with my time, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So where did you start learning these principles? Because these are definitely solid principles of, discipline and time management and, putting first things first. Like it's not like you always knew this since you were a kid. I'm sure this has been a process for you.
Yeah. um Over the years, I've read a lot and thought a lot about time management and that kind of thing. So that's just sort of, it's just the the accumulation of just lots of reading and thinking about time management. It's just something I've always been really interested in. I don't know why, but yeah, I think it's just and you take different principles and tips from people on that kind of stuff, and you just put it together, and I have my own very, very specific system of doing it. But yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just kind of all over the years, you've learned more and more is what you're saying.
Yeah, from just a variety of different books and speakers on time management. A
Yeah.
lot of it is very repetitive, but occasionally you get people who have really new insights and new ideas on how to manage time, and really, I mean, so much of it comes down to really basic principles like, putting first things first and having discipline and getting clear about how you want your life to be, and what your values are. That, I mean, all that kind of classic stuff that we've all heard so many times.
Yeah. Yeah. What steps do you think someone would need to take to get from, an unstructured day, they're not clear on their values, to, having that clarity?
The first thing I would do is I mean, if you're really asking about values, the first thing I would do is I would spend a lot of time, in prayer and study and thought, thinking about what I want my life to be about. And then I would write down, enough to cover the kinds of things you want to do in your life, but not too much where you get overwhelmed. So a value is a life direction. So you never achieve, for example, let's say someone says family is something that they really want to value in their life. You never achieve, the perfect family life. And so they might write that down, and then And then they start asking themselves, what are the top things that I want to do regarding family, you know? So for me it's spend time with my kids, it's teach them things, right? It's have go out and have different experiences with them or whatever it is, you know, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so that's I would get really clear about what my values are first, you know.
Anything that can change over the years because like family, at least in the same sense, for you and me is going to be a different value.
Yeah. So I do think how values show up can change. But I do think, you know, as a person of faith, I do think that there are some values that apply to all people. So first and foremost, I think love of God is is the primary mission of every human on this earth is to love God, and then the second thing is to love others. You know, and so those are things that I think are just innate in what it means to be a human. And then I
Yeah.
think that there are some things, gifts and talents and abilities we discover later on, or there might be certain periods in our life where we've really got to value this for a while and now it doesn't apply as much. And so, yeah, there's a dynamic nature to that. I think you're right.
Yeah. So kind of pulling on that string of love of God. I was at the gym the other day talking to this guy, and he was kind of telling me that there's not really any such thing as sin, and you decide what is a sin as you look back. But I don't think that is completely correct. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I do believe in objective morality. I do think that there are eternal things that are true and good, and I do think that there are things that are evil. And I bet most people, I think, I mean, if you really push them, I bet you can get them to admit that there are some things that are evil.
Yeah.
The question that often is sort of hovering around that people I don't think get a lot of clarity on is what is wrong and who gets to decide. You know, how does one determine what is wrong? But I think hopefully most people think that there is a way to do sin, there is a way to do evil, you know. And so once you ask them, I mean, you can ask them about really extreme examples at first, you know, do you think it's wrong to murder someone or something like that, right? And then hopefully they'll say, yeah, I do think that that's, you know, objectively wrong. And then you might ask, well, why do you think that? And I was talking to someone recently about some really complicated issues with theology and religion. And I could tell that they personally had not given much thought into why they believe certain things and, you know, why they have a certain morality. And hopefully that doesn't come across judgmental of me to say that, but you could just tell that they hadn't really thought about like, well, why do I think certain things are right or wrong, you know?
Yeah. Do you think people should examine their beliefs and, understand, okay, this is why I think this and not just follow the crowd?
100%. Yeah, and I don't think people realize, and this applies to us, you know, you and me as well, how much people think certain things because of the culture and time that they were born into. And so as a person of faith, you know, I think people need something that goes beyond current cultural historical situations. They need revelation to cut through culture and help people to see what's right and what's wrong, you know.
Yeah. And how can someone go about finding that, personal revelation for themselves?
Well, I think personal revelation is secondary to um, scriptural revelation and prophetic revelation. And so I think the best way to get personal revelation is to spend a lot of time in scripture and studying the words of prophets, um, you know, and really spending time with those uh, with public revelation is how I think our Catholic brothers and sisters would describe it as. But the more you read scripture and you try to live a life of faith and you're studying the words of God's authorized servants, then you can start to discern what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I've been noticing more and more because being born into a family who is part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, naturally that's just what we do and that's just what we believe. But as I've started, examining those beliefs more and, backing up, then it's like, oh, this really is what I believe. But that has come through the process of, daily scripture study and really looking into it and realizing that this is really what I believe, and I believe this to be true.
Yeah, the founding narrative of our faith tradition is about a teenage boy who just questions what he's being taught, and he says, I need to know what's true. And he decides that the only way he can know is by going to God directly, and of course he studies the Bible, and the Bible's a part of that process for him. But ultimately he says, I have to learn this for myself. That's one of the parts of the restoration that I find most compelling about the
Yeah.
way we discover truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's always a self process, because just because someone else believes doesn't mean that you believe. And so you got to find out for yourself.
Right. Right. 100%.
Yeah. What do you think the main objections are people have to actually looking into, the doctrine that our church teaches, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
Yeah. Well, when I talk with people who are, in a tricky spot in their faith journey, I usually will ask them, do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? And do you believe in the restoration? And typically we can start with one of those. And so if you're asking more, are you asking more specifically about the restoration, or are you
Yeah,
asking more
like
about belief in God? Or
more like belief in, because I believe that the church is the true church, but a lot of people, they won't actually read the Book of Mormon and, find out for themselves. And why do you think that is, that people won't do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there are two things. One, culturally, people have heard a lot of things about the church that Latter-day Saints almost find laughable sometimes, or just don't really represent what we teach or believe. And so I think it's hard to cut through sort of the cultural narratives around the restoration. But then also, the claims of the restoration are pretty bold. You have this kid who says, I saw God, I saw Jesus. There was an angel that told me about gold plates buried near my house. And so it right away, it's I think it invites a decision in people. Am I going to be open to that kind of radical miracle in our time, or am I not? And it probably pretty similar when Paul walked around the Mediterranean and said, "Oh, there was this person from Galilee named Jesus, and he was crucified by Romans, and God raised him from the dead." And he walked on water, and performed a miracle, and people were like, whoa, that's, they had never heard that before. And so anytime people go around claiming that God is acting in their time, it immediately, it's going to create a division. Like, am I going to be open to this or not? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. Do you have a lot of friends who are not members of our church?
I live in Utah and I teach at BYU.
Yeah.
And so I do have a few. I have a really close friend who's a Baptist pastor in Alabama, and we actually do a lot of interfaith work together, and he regularly comes to Utah and stays at our house, and he's a really close friend of mine, and I'm really grateful for his friendship, because we dialogue around a lot of things we agree on, and then where our differences lie, it really helps me get a lot of clarity on my own beliefs, and really really sharpens my own thinking on certain issues. And so he's a huge blessing that way.
Yeah. Have you noticed principles that show up across most all the religions?
Yeah, I think in a lot of world religions, obviously love and kindness and forgiveness and service and sacrifice, all of those kind of big things. But I do have to say this. I think when you really get into the narratives and the rituals and the practices associated with different faith traditions, things can start to look very, very different. It's kind of popular in our time to say, oh, all churches are sort of the same. But when you really, really study a religion or a faith tradition closely, you start to realize that there are big differences, and differences that matter. And more importantly, I would say, differences that we have to make a decision about. Do I think that God is embodied like Latter-day Saints do, or do I think he's outside of time and space and transcendent like traditional Christians do? And so that's we really start to ask ourselves some important things, based on how different traditions teach and the practices that they engage in.
Yeah, yeah. Talking on organized religion? Why do you think it's important and not just a personal relationship with God?
Yeah. So that I love this question, and it's very relevant. So one of the things that organized religion does is it creates a unity. It creates a strong sense of community, and so one that keeps theology and practice pure and consistent, right? But the other thing that organized religion does, that's just as important and maybe even more important, is it allows us to love more effectively. So because you and me are in the same congregation, Sam, because we're in the same ward, as you know, we're assigned different families to different people in our ward to watch over and take care of. And it's that comes out of organization. And there's always someone that's people can turn to if they need help, if they need support, whether it's spiritual or financial or whatever it is. And then plus, when churches are organized, they can pool resources together. And during a natural disaster or other dramatic events where people need help, the church can provide financial assistance or other assistance. And so there's lots of benefit. The other thing too, I would say, is that community can't exist without boundaries. And so when you define yourself certain ways and say, this is what we believe, this is what we don't believe, these are behaviors that are appropriate for our community, these behaviors are not, you start to create a community around those values. But if you don't have an organized structure, it's really hard to have a strong sense of community because you lack boundaries, if that makes sense, you know.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Do you have thoughts? It seems like there is this innate human need to connect with other people, and I think organized religion provides that in a sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. Humans are absolutely designed for relationship, and it's hard to even imagine what that would even look like for them to not exist in a world with other humans, right? And to have to work with them. And so, and I think organized religion provides that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're almost drifting away from human connection because, you can get food at the tap of a finger, you can work online. Is there, any specific things you do to continue to build relationships in your life?
Um, will you ask that again? I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're trying to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, so, I'm just thinking about how a lot of connection is going away because it gets easier and easier. Like you used to have to call the pizza place to get your food. Now you can just
Right.
order online and connection is going away. Is there anything specific that you're doing to preserve that connection within your own relationships?
Well, I think one thing that every person can do is to be a part of a church community, right? Um, there is a difference between watching church on a screen and in person. And I think it's a mysterious thing. Like people try to quantify it or qualify it or whatever, but I think when you're embodied in person with other people, you pick up on the nuances of communication. And you also, I think when humans are together, embodied, and there's a big crowd, whatever feeling that they're feeling, they feel it more intensely. And so if you are at Lavelle Edwards Stadium when Bear Bachmeyer throws a game-winning touchdown, it just is more of an emotional impact than if you're just at home by yourself, and and you might feel it somewhat connected because a lot of other people are cheering. Maybe there's some truth to that too. But so I think being a part of a church community is huge. I think having limits on technology, I think, is really important for preserving human connection. I also think that Sabbath should be, I'm drawing on another thinker right now, but Sabbath should be sort of an act of resistance against our modern culture's tendency to be busy and so I think having good Sabbath time where you say, okay, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to focus on most important things. That's a really important part of creating human connection.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that people who are able to stick to routines the longest, there's often a day where they don't do that. And it's interesting that that is kind of naturally baked into most religions, is that on the Sabbath you don't do a lot of things that you normally would.
Yeah, I think it is really, really healthy. In fact, I came across an NPR interview quite a few years ago with a woman who, well, is Jewish, but she's an atheist. She doesn't believe in God, but Her nationality is Jewish, but she still celebrates Sabbath because she just thinks it's so healthy for people, and she just thinks it's what humans need is that break every week.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. This has been a great conversation so far. For the last question, what do you think the biggest misconception is that you see in youth, regarding religion and their own relationship to God?
I would say if I would want youth to understand one thing about faith and religion, it's that the nature of God and who he is revealed in Jesus of Nazareth, particularly what Jesus did on the cross. And so people get all kinds of images about what God is and who he's like and how we understand him. But the ultimate revelation of God, the best way to understand God, is to study Jesus, and particularly his self sacrificial death on the cross for us. And when you see that kind of other centered love for all of humankind, it starts to reveal really who is what is the heart and character of God. And so people think that God's all powerful, he's perfectly loving. And I want to say true, true, but get specific. Study Jesus and learn what the nature of God is really like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I've noticed that for myself too. It's like you can't, it's about not being abstract. You gotta actually learn about it and see specifically what was done. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree.
thank
I
you.
agree.
Thank you for coming on today. This has been fun. It's fun to talk a little bit more about religion and then also to see how the principles of it. I've noticed that a lot of the principles taught in religion are very much principles in, the success industry too. Like it all principles are principles. But yeah, thank you for coming on today. This has been fun.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me. And it's always enjoyable talking with you, my friend.
Yes, sir. Thank you.